I invited my wife to the couple's trip the company was organizing that weekend. It would be a way for us to reconnect, to laugh together outside the four walls of routine, to breathe a different air than the city and our obligations imposed on us. She looked at me with a certain discomfort in her eyes, then smiled with her mouth rather than her eyes. She said she'd rather go with her boss. I froze. For a second, I thought I'd heard wrong. I asked, in a whisper, why she'd rather go with her boss than with her own husband. And she, with the naturalness of someone asking for salt at dinner, replied that she had feelings for him. That the trip could help her career. That she needed to get closer to him if she wanted to land the job she'd always dreamed of. And then she looked at me with a kind of compassion, or perhaps pity, and said she hoped I understood. As if simply verbalizing her betrayal could make it less painful. It destroyed me from the inside out. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't beg. I just stood there, in silence, staring at a woman who no longer existed for me, but who was still there, breathing, talking and deciding to go to bed with another man, in the name of so-called professional advancement. I returned home feeling a kind of pain that can't be described, only carried. My throat was dry, my chest tight, my eyes burned, but I couldn't shed a single tear. I sat at the dining table, still set from the night before, where we'd eaten in silence once again, and opened my laptop. I wrote a letter. A goodbye letter, but without drama. Just facts, wounds, and the end. I enclosed the divorce papers and asked the delivery man to leave them at her door the next day. When they told me she'd signed, I simply thanked them and never looked back. For weeks, I woke to the emptiness of one side of the bed and the knowledge that I'd been replaced, discarded like an old rag. The pain was constant, silent, and corrosive. But time, with its slow pace, rebuilt me piece by piece. Until, one day, I met someone. Someone who looked at me as if I were whole, even though I was broken. Who didn't apologize for loving me, nor demand sacrifices disguised as opportunities. With her, the days had color again. Mornings were no longer heavy, afternoon coffees were accompanied by sincere smiles, and Sundays once again felt like home. And when she told me she was pregnant, I felt that perhaps God still had beautiful plans for me. We had built something pure, true, and new. And so, when I least expected it, there she was. The woman who abandoned me. The one who traded me in. The one who chose another bed. She appeared out of nowhere, invading the office like a ghost from the past, her eyes puffy and her face aged by the weight of her bad choices. She said she regretted it. That no relationship had worked since she left me. That she had realized, too late, that I was the man of her life. And she asked me for another chance. She cried. She called me by name as if she still had the right to pronounce my existence. She said I was her home, that her boss had only used her body as a shortcut, but that no hug tasted like mine. And I, just looked at her. She waited for an answer with hope in her eyes. But all I could say was, "It's too late." And it was in that moment that she understood. She understood the weight of her choices. She understood that those who cheat don't just lose their partner, they lose peace, trust, and the right to return. They lose the right to forgiveness when it's no longer necessary for the betrayed. The curious thing, and perhaps the cruelest thing of all, is that days later she sent me a message. A short one. It simply said, "I found a letter from you, the one you wrote before we left." I didn't understand right away. She then sent me a photo of the letter I had left on her desk, which she had supposedly never read. The letter in which I told her I loved her, that I wanted to rebuild our marriage, that I had prepared a surprise for us, and that I was willing to do anything to rekindle our love. She hadn't read it. She had left the papers on her desk and gone out with her boss. And now, after so long, she found the words that could have changed everything, but it was too late. That letter had been found inside a forgotten book, in a recent move she had made. She said that rereading those words was like slowly dying. And perhaps it was. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was what I wrote at the end of that letter. The last line. The most sincere. The most devastating. A sentence that sealed everything. Something I myself forgot until I saw that letter again, by chance, years later, in an unexpected reunion with the past. That last sentence would change everything. It was never said. It was never read. And now, there's only one way to find out. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of cheating, ever. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry a profound truth: betrayal destroys homes, feelings, and entire lives. Each story is a warning, a reflection, a scar told out loud. Get ready, you're about to hear a story shocking, the kind that leaves a mark. Good story. They met as so many couples meet, by chance, in the midst of a hurried routine and with no intention of any major encounters. His name was Daniel, a practical, disciplined man who, at 33, had already achieved career stability and an emotional tranquility rare for someone his age. He worked in the finance department of a multinational company and approached life with the same zeal he applied to numbers. Everything had to be in place, function smoothly, and deliver consistent results. Her name was Isabella, an intense woman, passionate about art and driven by emotions. She had studied journalism but had found her calling in corporate communications, where she managed, somehow, to combine sensitivity and strategy. Isabella was 30 when she met Daniel. He was passing through a company event where she coordinated the press department, and the look they exchanged in their first conversation was one of recognition, not of faces, but of souls that feel seen after so long walking blindly. The connection didn't come like a bolt of lightning, nor a hurricane, but like a warm, steady breeze. They began seeing each other frequently, talking about books, movies, the world's pains, and their personal dreams. She had a lightness that disarmed him. He had a firmness that made her feel safer than ever before. Within a few months, they were inseparable. The apartment, once a haven of silence, now smelled of fresh coffee in the morning, laughter in the hallways, and promises whispered in each other's ears. It wasn't long before they made their relationship official, and soon their friends were treating them as a unit, one of those couples who seem perfectly made. And perhaps they were, at least for a while. Daniel had always been methodical, but Isabella never minded. She liked watching him review the week's schedule on Sunday nights while she sat on the sofa painting her feet with clear nail polish. There was an unspoken harmony there, even though their worlds were different. He loved the predictability of Excel, she was enchanted by the unpredictability of words. He needed silence to think, she needed music to exist. At first, these differences were charming, a reminder that they could both learn from each other. Isabella laughed when she watched Daniel time the rice, and he, in turn, was enchanted by the way she could get lost in reverie in the middle of a conversation and still make sense in the end. Love, there, seemed enough. It seemed. Routine arrived slowly. First as a shy visitor, then as a permanent guest. Bills, deadlines, family commitments, dinners that changed from candlelit to quick meals in front of the television, arrived. Daniel remained dedicated, insisting on driving her to work, even when traffic tripled the commute time. He stopped at markets on the way home, organized the couple's finances, and always left a message in the morning. Isabella, on the other hand, felt increasingly overwhelmed by the pressure of work and the internal demand she placed on herself. The communications field where she worked demanded more and more of her every month. She needed to prove she was capable, that she had a voice, that she could lead. Her life revolved around presentations, emails, events, and unattainable goals. Still, she struggled. She tried to keep the lightness, the details, the affection alive. But sometimes, at night, she found herself staring at the ceiling and wondering where she'd left the woman she used to daydream about. They didn't fight. They weren't a couple of explosions, but of accumulated silences. When something bothered them, Daniel immersed himself in work, and Isabella pretended not to notice. The absence of conflict was, in a way, the conflict itself. The love was there, but somewhat dusty. The house remained in order, birthdays were celebrated, social media displayed genuine smiles, but deep down, they both seemed to sense something had shifted, like a piece of furniture out of place that you only notice when you trip. Isabella began to spend more time away. She justified it with work, with last-minute commitments, with meetings that stretched on. Daniel, too busy with the company's new goals, didn't question it. He trusted her with an almost innocent abandon. He made plans for a trip at the end of the year, something for two, perhaps to the mountains or the beach, where they could reconnect. She listened to his ideas with a sweet smile, but her eyes were already elsewhere. Still, there were moments when everything felt right. A long Saturday breakfast, a late-night movie, a hug. It was moments like these that kept the relationship going. Fragments of affection that still held up, even as everything around them slowly darkened. Daniel believed it was just a phase. All couples went through it. The demands of adulthood, the natural wear and tear. He planned to propose a vow renewal at the end of the year, write a new letter, as he had at the beginning of their relationship, reminding her of everything he still wanted to build with her. Isabella smiled when he spoke of it, but there was a mismatch in his tone, as if the soundtrack of their lives were already on different frequencies. Over time, Isabella's absences began to hurt more. She became increasingly emotionally absent, and Daniel, without even knowing why, began to feel small within his own home. The silences that had once been bearable now weighed like concrete. There was something about her he could no longer grasp. A distant thought, a slight rush in a kiss, a hesitation in her gaze. Still, he persisted. He cooked dinners, organized weekend getaways, made simple surprises, hidden notes in her pockets, undated flowers. He believed that gestures rekindled feelings. That love, when true, knew how to wait. Isabella, for her part, struggled with contradictory feelings. There was guilt, affection, doubt. She felt trapped between what she had and what she thought she deserved. Daniel's stability comforted her, but at the same time, it suffocated her. She longed to be recognized, desired, admired for something beyond her role as a companion. The world demanded performance, and she believed she needed to offer more, be more, live more. And this, in some twisted way, drove her away. She remained by his side, but in essence, she was beginning to leave. The relationship remained largely uneventful, but the cracks remained. And in the midst of all this, an opportunity arose. An invitation from the company for a couple's trip, focused on integration and recognition of employees and their families. Daniel saw it as the perfect opportunity to rekindle something between them. He planned everything carefully, enthusiastically, as if he were organizing the honeymoon they never had. Isabella, upon hearing the invitation, hesitated. She said she needed to check her schedule. She said it might not be the best time. And Daniel, though he said nothing, felt his heart flutter for the first time in a long time. But he still believed. He believed she would. That she was just tired. That she needed time. And that night, while she slept on the opposite side of the bed, he lay awake. He stared at the dark ceiling of the room and tried to remember the last time she'd looked him in the eye for more than 5 seconds. A hole was growing inside him, but his faith was still greater than his fear. He woke early, made coffee, left a sweet note on her desk, and left for work with his chest full of hope. Little did he know that very day, the answer he'd been waiting for would come. And that she wouldn't just change the course of that trip, she would change the course of his life forever. Daniel spent the next few days waiting for confirmation. He tried not to show anxiety, but every small gesture from Isabella became a clue he analyzed more precisely than any financial report he'd ever seen. She said she was tired, that work was demanding, that perhaps this trip wasn't the right time. But there was something more. Something in the way she kissed him on the forehead as she left, as if thanking him, not as if wishing. Something in the way she avoided looking him in the eye for too long, as if hiding a truth behind silence. He knew her gestures. And now, everything seemed rehearsed. Still, he resisted the urge to doubt. He preferred to believe in the accumulation of years, in the bond built slowly, in the shared moments that should be enough to keep them strong. At work, anticipation for the trip was growing. Colleagues were chatting in the hallways, couples were planning itineraries alongside their professional meetings, and Daniel was excited about the prospect of a fresh start. He planned little surprises for his days away, explored local restaurant options, and booked a sunset boat trip. He imagined Isabella smiling in the sun, laughing for no reason, as she had in the first few months. He wanted to see her light-hearted again. He wanted to see them together, truly, without the burden of recent times. And when he finally asked, directly, if she would accompany him, her answer came with a practiced smile and a voice too low to be firm. She said she'd rather not go. And before he could ask why, she finished with a sentence that made him freeze inside, actually. I'm going with my boss. For a moment, the world lost its sound. Daniel's gaze locked with hers, trying to find some trace of irony, of playfulness, of delirium. But what he saw was serenity. Isabella seemed calm, as if she'd rehearsed those words for days. She said it was important for her growth within the company, that it would be an opportunity to get closer to the leadership, to show how committed she was to the projects. She spoke as if he should understand, as if it were natural for a woman to turn down a trip with her husband to go with her boss seeking advancement. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, with dignity drowned in pain, if there was something more behind that choice. And she hesitated. Took a deep breath. And replied that she was feeling something, yes. That there was a connection happening and that she needed to understand what it was. And that if he truly loved her, he should respect her freedom to pursue what made her happy. That moment tore Daniel apart. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the way she delivered her. Cold, objective, almost businesslike. The woman with whom he'd shared years of emotional development was now informing him, as if it were a statement, that she was choosing a different path. And that path didn't include him. Isabella said everything with a polite, almost gentle coldness, as if she were returning an old gift. He listened to every word like someone listening to the sentence of a loss foretold. But still, he stood his ground. He didn't beg, he didn't question. He simply said he would respect her choice. And he left. On the street, the wind bit at his face with a force he barely felt. Automatic steps, trembling hands, his head spinning. That scene replayed in his mind like a cursed movie. It was as if life had slipped from his grasp without warning. And yet, as absurd as it seemed, a part of him still searched for an explanation. Still tried to find within himself a version that could be salvaged. But all that remained was silence. And it was in that silence that he wrote the letter. A dry, unadorned farewell. He left the paperwork ready. He sent it. And waited. Isabella signed the documents days later, without ceremony, without a meeting, without emotional feedback. The end arrived the same way the beginning had been constructed, in words. But this time, there were no promises, only rubble. Daniel didn't cry. He held firm, even as his body felt heavier with each morning. Loneliness embraced him with icy arms, and the days dragged by like wounds that wouldn't heal. He tried to move on. Not immediately, but over time. He threw away photos, emptied the house of her traces, cleaned out the closets of his memories. He met other people. Nothing serious at first. There was no room in his heart for another love so soon. But time, with its silent insistence, stitched together the parts of him that had been torn apart. And it was then, almost by accident, that he met Laura. There was no charm at first sight, but a peace he no longer remembered. She listened to him attentively, not because she wanted answers, but because she liked the way he saw the world. She was different from Isabella in every way. Simpler, more direct, more present. Their meetings became more frequent, and the days less gray. Laura didn't invade Daniel's space, simply offered her own. And he, little by little, allowed himself to be there. When she told him she was pregnant, the news took him by surprise, but brought with it a relief he hadn't expected. A new beginning. A new chance. Something pure emerging from a past in ruins. Life finally seemed to want to give back some of what it had taken. Daniel regained his rhythm, started smiling fearlessly again, started making plans. He was in an important meeting when the door to the room opened unexpectedly. It was her. Isabella. Time had changed her. She was thinner, her eyes filled with something he couldn't tell if it was guilt, sadness, or despair. She asked to speak with him. They told her it wasn't the right time, but she insisted. He left the room, more out of courtesy than desire. She was different, but the impact was still there. She said she needed to talk, that she had things to say, that she regretted it. He listened to her silently, like someone listening to an echo from the past. She said that since she left him, nothing had worked. That relationships didn't last, that she felt empty, that none of the promises made by the other side had been fulfilled. And that now she understood what she had lost. Daniel took a deep breath. He listened to those words like someone listening to an old song playing on a distant radio. It no longer moved him. It no longer destroyed him. He didn't say much. He simply thanked her for her sincerity. And said that his life had moved on. And that there was someone waiting for him at home. Someone who hadn't left him. Isabella tried to hold back her tears, but failed. She told him she still loved him. And he, with an almost cruel serenity, replied that he was no longer hers. He said time had passed. And that he wouldn't come back. She then stared at him silently, as if searching his eyes for confirmation that it was real. And it was. Finally, she left. Daniel returned to the meeting, his body light, but his mind alert. The encounter had shaken him more than he would have liked. That night, when he arrived home, he found Laura lying on the sofa, her feet covered, a book open on her lap. He sat beside her, kissed her forehead, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at home again. But what he didn't know was that, on that very day, something would be discovered. A forgotten detail, something buried in time, would resurface. Something Isabella had kept hidden, perhaps through carelessness, perhaps through denial. A silent secret, lost among the pages of an ancient book. And this secret, still invisible to everyone, was about to be revealed. The light rain tapped insistently on the window, but Daniel seemed oblivious to the sound. I was in my home office, organizing some old papers I needed to review before the baby's arrival. Laura was sleeping early that night, exhausted from the last intense weeks of pregnancy. In the silence of the room, his eyes wandered among folders, old invoices, and envelopes forgotten at the bottom of a box he hadn't opened in a long time. Amidst the clutter, he found something he didn't immediately recognize, a hardcover notebook, wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. He didn't remember keeping it there. When he opened it, he saw it wasn't an ordinary notebook, but a diary. The handwriting on the back cover was unmistakable. It belonged to Isabella. A chill ran down his spine, but he still kept turning the pages, driven by a curiosity he couldn't explain. The first few lines contained personal notes, random thoughts, everyday observations. Nothing special. But a few pages later, he stopped. There was a folded sheet of paper inside the diary. Unfolding it, he immediately recognized what it was, the letter. The one he'd written before sending her away. The letter he'd left on the table with the divorce papers. The letter she'd said she'd never read. His heart raced. He picked up the sheet with trembling hands, read each word carefully, and when he reached the end, he saw her signature. And just below, a line written in her same handwriting. One sentence. Just one. But it made all the blood in his body freeze. I found this letter before the trip, but chose to ignore it. Daniel stood still for long seconds, staring at those words as if they were a punch. She had read them. She knew. She knew he still believed, that he wanted to rebuild, that he was offering her one last bridge. And yet, she chose to leave. Not by impulse, not by mistake. By choice. And she didn't just ignore the letter's contents. She hid the fact that she had read it. She said, coldly, that she had never seen it. That revelation brought a new layer of pain, unlike anything he had felt until then. A betrayal within a betrayal. A deliberate disregard for a final gesture of love. He got up from his chair and walked to the kitchen as if trying to escape the weight of the discovery, but it followed him, pressed against his chest. He took a deep breath, but the air seemed to stay put. The next day, he decided to confront her. Not because he wanted answers. But because he needed to put an end to it all. He called. She answered, her voice surprised, almost anxious. She said she hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. He asked her to come to his house. He said there was something she needed to see. She didn't hesitate. She arrived about an hour later, makeup free, dressed simply, with an expression filled with expectation and perhaps hope. He greeted her with a hard but restrained look. Without unnecessary words, he handed her the notebook. She recognized it immediately. She was silent for a moment, her eyes roving the cover as if staring at a forbidden memory. Daniel crossed his arms, firm. Then she began to speak. He said he'd found that notebook weeks earlier while packing boxes for his move. That rereading the letter had been like reliving the moment when everything could have been different. That he'd cried when he realized what he'd let slip. Daniel, without changing his tone, asked what had made her lie. Why had she said she'd never seen the letter? She looked away, took a deep breath, and finally confessed. He said that day, when he found the letter, he'd only read the first few lines. And that, in that moment, she felt angry. Angry that he was still trying to save what she'd already decided to destroy. That she was too enchanted by the new, too dazzled by the attention she was receiving from the other side, blinded by the promises of a brilliant professional future and a passion that seemed more intense, more alive, more urgent. She said that, instead of being moved by his words, she felt pressured. That she wanted to show she had control, that she could choose. And she chose to ignore him. Daniel clenched his fists. The silence between them was thick. She continued, her voice breaking, saying she'd considered responding. That she'd almost left the letter there, with a note. But in the end, she'd decided to hide everything inside the diary, as if to erase that gesture from the world. As if to silence that attempt at salvation to justify her own escape. And that now, after everything, she couldn't forgive herself for it. He said the worst part wasn't that he'd found out, but that he'd found out on his own. Without her having the courage to say it. He then asked, with a calmness that bordered on cruelty, if she truly thought some part of him still wanted to hear her. If she truly believed there was a way back after that. She didn't answer right away. She simply said she no longer harbored illusions. That she didn't want to win him back. She just needed him to know. To understand. To see her not just as the woman who betrayed him, but as someone who had also betrayed herself in the process. That she had found nothing she was looking for, only emptiness. And that the letter, forgotten between the pages of an old diary, was now the purest thing between them. Daniel took the notebook back, opened it to the last page, and showed her the line she'd written. He said that sentence was the answer he needed. That in that moment, by choosing to ignore it, she'd killed any chance. Any future. Any forgiveness. That now, there was no more room. She tried to say she knew, but that she needed to hear it from him. He just nodded. He said she could go now. That he had a new story being written. And this time, there would be no torn pages. She left without another word, her eyes red, her face wet. As she walked through the gate, she turned to him one last time. She wanted to say something, but stopped herself. And then she left. Hours later, Daniel returned to his office. He sat down. He picked up the original letter and read it again. At the end, he added a new sentence. Not to her, but to himself. Then he closed the diary, tied the blue ribbon, and put it away in a box. One he never intended to open again. And there, amid the shadows of the past, now rested the entire truth. Not the one that had been spoken, but the one that had been silenced for too long. That night, after Isabella left his house for the last time, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat on the floor of the baby's room, staring at the pale walls and newly assembled furniture, imagining the sounds that hadn't yet existed, laughter, crying, hurried footsteps. The memory of Isabella, her teary eyes, the confession muffled by shame, all still echoed like a persistent whisper in his mind, but it no longer hurt the same way. It was different. It was a dull discomfort, not an open wound. The revelation that she had read the letter and chosen to ignore it didn't destroy what he had built with Laura, but it awakened something in him he couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was the definitive realization that love, even when sincere, doesn't survive when it's thrown to the ground by those who don't have the courage to hold it with both hands. In the following days, Daniel focused on preparing for his son's arrival. He immersed himself in work only when necessary and spent more and more time at home, helping Laura, putting together a layette, and reading about fatherhood. Doctor's appointments were constant, and he made a point of being present at all of them. Laura, despite the fatigue typical of advanced pregnancy, was serene. There was a calmness in her eyes that Daniel learned to admire, unlike the volatile intensity he had experienced with Isabella. Her every gesture seemed to say, "I'm here, completely." And that was all he needed now. But fate, capricious as ever, still had one more letter in store. A month after their reunion, Daniel received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter. Upon opening it, he recognized Isabella's handwriting, but the content wasn't a repeat of what she'd already said. It was something new, deeper. She said that, after that last conversation, she'd started therapy. That she could no longer stand running away from her own decisions. That she needed to face what she'd done not only to him, but to herself. And that, rereading not only the forgotten letter but also her own diaries, she realized she'd never known how to handle the calm, steady love he offered. She was addicted to conflict, to the instant fire, to the admiration of others. She said she'd spent her life seeking recognition and that, in the process, she'd lost the only eye that truly saw her. Daniel read it in silence. The letter ended with an unexpected sentence. "I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing because, for the first time, I understand the depth of the hole I left inside myself." He didn't respond. He didn't feel the need to. Her words no longer hit him like they once did. They merely reaffirmed what he already knew, that not all the people we love are ready to be truly loved. And that some only realize this when there's no turning back. In the weeks that followed, Isabella disappeared from the radar. No message, no sighting, no sign. Daniel, in turn, followed. The birth was approaching, and with it, a good, electric, lively anxiety. Laura could feel the light contractions starting, and on a gray morning, her water broke. He took her to the hospital with his heart racing, his eyes alert, his spirit alert. Everything went well. Hours later, he was holding his son in his arms, his skin wrinkled, his cries loud, the warmth of a new beginning cradled by tears of joy. Daniel looked at that little being and felt that, finally, he had overcome something he couldn't name. It was as if, after all this, he had been rewarded with a new life, literally. In the following days, many friends stopped by to visit, messages arrived from all corners, and Daniel felt surrounded by true love. But unexpectedly, on a quiet afternoon when Laura was sleeping with the baby in her arms, the doorbell rang. He opened the door, expecting some delivery or visit, but there, on the other side, stood a woman with loose hair, a serious expression, and an envelope in her hands. It wasn't Isabella. It was someone he didn't know. She introduced herself as a former co-worker of hers. She said she needed to deliver something. That it was important. Daniel hesitated, but took the envelope. The woman left without explanation. He closed the door, sat in the living room, and slowly opened the envelope, unsure of what to expect. Inside were copies of pages from Isabella's diary. Handwritten. But what she read there wasn't just a rant. They were precise descriptions of her feelings in the days leading up to the fateful trip. She recounted how she discovered Daniel's letter when she arrived home that day. She described how he had set the table, leaving everything ready, including the envelope. But most striking was a page in which she recounted her feelings upon reading, for the first time, the last line of the letter. A line Daniel had forgotten he had written. A line he had never mentioned to anyone, not even himself, since. And there it was, in firm handwriting, written by her: "If you choose another path, I will never be here again." Isabella said it paralyzed her. That the fear of facing a definitive end made her hide the letter deep in her notebook. That she wanted to keep it, as if time could give her the right to return whenever she wanted. But he had warned her. He had made it clear. And she didn't listen. Daniel read it with a tight chest, but something inside him was also freeing itself. It was as if that last piece of history, finally unearthed, closed the cycle with surgical precision. She had made her choice. He had too. And now, they both lived with the consequences. He got up, went to the crib, saw his son sleeping, his little hands clenched into small fists, and felt at peace. A kind of peace that came not from forgetting, but from complete understanding. The past no longer needed to be denied, nor relived. It was there, told, written, closed. Days later, walking with Laura and the baby on a shy, sunny morning, they stopped at a small cafe to rest. While she ordered something light, Daniel stepped away for a moment to answer a call. When he returned, he saw Laura sitting at the table, smiling at her son playing with his fingers in her lap. It was a simple scene, but in that moment, he understood something more clearly than ever. It wasn't about starting over. It was about finally being where he always deserved to be. A place where love wasn't tested by pain, nor asked for out of desperation. It was simply lived, whole, day after day. When they got home, Laura found an envelope on the dresser. Daniel, surprised, picked up the paper and turned it over. It was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was Isabella's. Laura looked at him with silent doubt, and he asked her to wait. He read it alone, in the next room. It was a goodbye letter. Not dramatic, not loaded. Just a letter in which Isabella said she had sold the apartment, quit her job, and was going to live abroad for a while. He wanted to reconnect with who he was before everything else. He thanked her for having been loved. And he asked that if their paths ever crossed again, he would look at her kindly. Daniel took a deep breath. He folded the paper, put it in the drawer, and returned to the living room. Laura didn't ask. She simply held his hand firmly. And in that touch, there was no doubt, no fear, no competition with ghosts. There was simply presence. And that was more than enough. Daniel's story with Isabella wouldn't disappear. But it also no longer defined what would come next. It was part of the fabric, not destiny. A closed chapter, with no loose ends, no return. The kind of closure life rarely allows, but when it does, leaves a clear space for true love to blossom. That night, while everyone slept, Daniel sat back in his office. He picked up his diary, opened it to the last page, and wrote one last line. Not for her. Not for Laura. But for himself. A line that encapsulated everything he had experienced and opened, gently and firmly, the space for what was yet to come. After that, he turned out the light. And slept as he hadn't slept in years. His soul at peace and his heart, finally, whole. Time, merciless and wise, continued its course, as if oblivious to the turmoil that ran through the hearts of those who survive invisible losses. Daniel spent the days following that last letter from Isabella with a kind of heavy serenity, like someone carrying a silence full of the past on their shoulders but learning to walk with it without letting it crush their steps. There was no longer anger, no indignation, nor any desire for revenge. What remained was a warm feeling of completeness, as if a piece of the puzzle had finally been put into place, revealing a picture he needed to see in its entirety, even if the colors weren't beautiful. There was sadness, yes, but it was a quiet sadness, the kind that no longer screams for answers, only whispers lessons. The birth of his son brought a routine into Daniel's life that demanded absolute presence. The sleepless nights, the sudden crying, the little scares, and the big discoveries made the days less about memories and more about the present. Laura demonstrated a quiet strength, a patience that came not from effort but from nature. She was a woman who, unlike those he had known in the past, didn't seek to be seen to feel alive. She simply was. And this simplicity touched him more than any speech. They didn't need grand gestures, daily care was enough, the knowing glances amidst the chaos, the smiles exchanged between one bottle and the next. And, even when fatigue hit hard, there was a shared certainty between them, they were building something solid, real, and, above all, light. But it would be naive to believe that peace settles without a shadow. Sometimes, in the wee hours of the morning, when everything was asleep, Daniel would still find himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about how small deviations in trajectory can completely alter the fate of two people. He reflected on choices, on time, on regrets and forgiveness that were never asked for, but that the soul had to grant. It was in these moments that he understood, more clearly, that true love is not what survives the storm, but what learns to build itself after it, from the rubble of what once was. And this didn't require forgetting, but acceptance. Past pain doesn't disappear, it just shifts within us. And he had learned to live with that. One day, during a walk in the park, Laura commented, with the naturalness of someone without ghosts, that perhaps it would be a good idea to move. She said she felt the need for a new home, a space that was just theirs, without traces, without shared memories of old stories. Daniel agreed. He didn't need to think twice. It was time. They found a simple house with a large yard, where their son could play and grow up free. The moving process was quick. And symbolic. Each packed box was also a gesture of farewell. A definitive goodbye to what was left behind. In the new house, life took on new sounds, new rhythms. It was as if, finally, he had freed himself from the last anchor that tied him to the past. One day, while rummaging through the bottom drawer of the old office he had brought to his new home, he accidentally found the photo from the day he proposed to Isabella. It was a beautiful image, two genuine smiles framed by a golden sunset. He held her hand firmly and tenderly. For a moment, he stood there, staring at it like someone contemplating a painting that no longer belongs to him, but that had once been part of his world. He considered tearing up the photo, throwing it away. But he didn't. He put it away in a box, along with other memories that no longer hurt but still deserved respect. Because, despite everything, that smile was real. At least in that moment frozen in time. And that, too, was part of his story. Meanwhile, Isabella was writing her own pages elsewhere. She had moved to a coastal town, far from everything she knew. She lived alone, but for the first time without feeling lonely. She taught writing classes to young people at an NGO and spent her late afternoons writing in a new notebook, without blue ribbons, without buried secrets. She had understood that losing Daniel wasn't the end of the world, but the beginning of rebuilding herself. She still loved him, but not in the possessive way she'd always loved him. It was a silent love, of someone who recognizes someone's worth and truly wants them to be happy. She had stopped trying to convince herself she deserved a second chance. Now she understood that some choices can't be undone. And that loving, sometimes, means accepting that you're no longer part of someone's life. In one of the letters she would never send, she wrote, "Life taught me the hard way that when love knocks on the door, you shouldn't pretend you're not home. And that when someone extends their hand, the greatest cruelty is to pretend you didn't see it." That wasn't an apology. It was a confession to herself. The way she found to free herself from the chains she herself had placed on her. Her days were now calm, her gestures simple. There was still longing, but no longer despair. Daniel continued working, now at a more human pace. He dedicated his mornings to the company and his afternoons to his family. On weekends, he made a point of cooking, something that had once seemed like a luxury and was now a pleasure. Laura loved to see him in the kitchen, in an apron, focused on his recipes. It was in these moments that she felt even closer to him, seeing how there was room for tenderness even after everything he'd faced. Sometimes, she'd watch her son sleeping in his father's lap and think about how love can be regenerative. Not the idealized love, but the kind built through mistakes, silences, and new beginnings. And that was all she wanted for them. However, not everything was completely resolved. Certain people, even distant ones, continue to influence the atmosphere of life without needing to be present. Daniel was still sought out by colleagues from his old company who commented on Isabella, her abrupt departure, how she had disappeared from the radar. Some still hoped for a reconciliation, ignoring the deeper meaning of the story. He didn't bother to explain. He simply smiled and changed the subject. The past, now, was a place he no longer needed to inhabit. On a sunny Sunday, they attended their son's baptism. The ceremony was simple, surrounded only by close friends. When the priest asked what name he had chosen, Daniel looked at Laura, squeezed her hand, and answered firmly. The boy's name meant rebirth. And in that moment, he realized he couldn't have made a better choice. There, at that altar, before the new life they had created, he felt he was closing the last open cycle. Now, it was just a matter of what was to come. On the way home, with the baby asleep in the back seat and the soft music filling the car, Laura looked out the window and commented that, despite everything, she felt life had been generous to them. Daniel, silently, held her hand firmly. And in that gesture, there was everything: forgiveness, surrender, rebuilding, and a silent promise that from then on, nothing would be wasted. Because she had learned the hard way that true love needs no proof, only presence. And there, in that car, on that road with no return to the past, everything was exactly where it should be. But something still waited to be said. A final choice. A dilemma that, while not hurtful, still demanded an answer. And it was that answer that approached. Silent, inevitable footsteps, preparing to knock on the door once more. On that gray October morning, the light filtered in softly through the porch, casting irregular patterns on the floor of the new house through the gaps in the curtains. Daniel sat in the armchair in the makeshift office, surrounded by unopened boxes, scattered papers, baby toys mixed with books and work documents. The house was beginning to take on the scent of family, the sound of routine, the vivid details that only time and affection can build. Upstairs, Laura rocked her son patiently, whispering songs she'd made up on the spot with a tenderness Daniel admired from afar. Since the move, the sense of belonging had deepened between them. Now it was no longer just a rebuilding, it was an expansion. And even without saying it, they both knew, they were where they were meant to be. But like every story born from the rubble of another, there were still doors that needed to be closed with a firm lock, and Daniel was about to realize that not all of them had a key. It was late afternoon when he received the call. The number was unfamiliar, and the voice on the other end, though muffled, sounded formal, almost corporate. A man claimed to be a lawyer and asked Daniel to attend a brief, urgent meeting at an address he didn't recognize, but which was just a few kilometers away. The reason? Unfinished business related to Isabella. At first, he hesitated. He considered refusing. There was no point in dwelling on the past. But something in the formality of the voice, the weight of those words, made him consider it might be necessary. He called Laura, who didn't hide her surprise. She, as always, listened silently and simply said she trusted him. If it was something that deserved closure, so be it. And if not, he should return with a peaceful heart. Daniel thanked him, hung up, and headed to the address late that cloudy afternoon. Upon arriving at the building, he was greeted by a man in a dark suit, with a neutral expression and a meticulous demeanor. The office was small, smelling of old archives and stale coffee. He sat down, and the man quickly began to explain. He said that Isabella had left a recently dated notarized document naming Daniel as the sole recipient of a set of personal letters, as well as a fund she had saved over the past few years. Daniel raised his eyebrows in surprise. He didn't know what to say. The lawyer gently handed him a small box, sealed with a simple seal, and said that inside were the letters and a flash drive with voice recordings. He explained that Isabella had requested that these be delivered only after a certain period, and that this deadline had expired 2 days ago. He asked if he would like to sign for receipt, and it took a second for Daniel to grip the pen firmly and sign his name, as if stamping an unsolicited destination. Back in the car, the box on the seat next to him seemed to weigh more than its size suggested. Daniel didn't open it immediately. He took a deep breath, started the engine, and continued driving aimlessly, as the sky began to pour down in a silent rain, the kind that slowly wets, like unshed tears. He stopped in an empty parking lot, partially rolled down the windows, and only then unsealed the seal. Inside, he found 7 letters, all dated on different days, and a hand-labeled flash drive with the words, "Last Confession." He picked up the first letter. The paper was thick, the handwriting familiar, but the content surprising. Isabella wrote not as someone begging for forgiveness, but as someone acknowledging her own humanity. She said she had spent months revisiting every decision she made, every gesture that turned into distance, every silence she used as a shield. She confessed that part of her knew, from the beginning, that she had never loved the man she left with. That it was fascination, escape, a desire to feel desired again. But he also admitted that the betrayal didn't begin with the act, but well before, the day he chose to withdraw emotionally and began to feed on absences to justify his own. Each letter brought layers. Memories he'd forgotten, versions of the same events seen from a different angle. Small but impactful revelations. She told him that once, she'd almost gone back. That she'd been in the parking lot of his building a week after the divorce, with a letter in her hand and teary eyes, but that, seeing him through the window holding a package of diapers, laughing on the phone with Laura, who was still just a friend, she understood she no longer belonged there. That there was no room for her doubts in a landscape of certainties. The letters continued with this raw cadence, and the last one contained a direct request, that he listen to the contents of the flash drive, but only if he was willing to listen with an open heart, without judgment, without rushing. It took Daniel 2 days to work up the courage. The night he finally connected the device to the computer, the house was silent, the baby was asleep, and Laura had gone out to visit a friend. The first voice he heard was hers, trembling, low, as if each word was struggling to come out. Isabella began by thanking him for listening. She said she had recorded it as a way of leaving her final truth in the world. She confessed that, deep down, she never understood why she sabotaged the love she had. That she often looked in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman who had chosen her boss, and only saw a frightened girl, seeking approval in the wrong place. She said she didn't want to justify anything, but that she needed to tell him one last thing. Something she had never had the courage to tell anyone. The recording continued with long pauses. And then it came. The revelation. She explained that, in the days leading up to the trip, when Daniel was still trying to convince her to go with him, she was pregnant. The pregnancy was his. And she knew it. But amidst her inner turmoil, her pride, and her desire to prove her independence, she decided not to tell him. She said she had taken the test in secret, cried in silence, and decided alone not to go through with the pregnancy. The following week, she terminated the pregnancy at a private clinic. She said she didn't feel ready, that she didn't want to tie Daniel down again, that she still believed she was heading towards something better. But deep down, she knew it was just fear. And that silence, that decision, became the cruelest burden she ever carried. Daniel felt the ground open up. He stood up, walked in circles, unsure of what to do with his body. The idea that a child of his had existed, even if only briefly, and had been erased from his life without his knowledge left him breathless. He repeated the words in his mind, trying to understand, trying to fit this into the narrative of the woman he had learned to forgive. But that piece didn't fit. It was a breaking point. And, at the same time, it was the closure of a wound he hadn't known existed. Because, finally, he understood that it wasn't just about what she had done to him, but what she had done to herself. She didn't want revenge, she didn't want to get back together, she didn't want justification. She just wanted to be heard. For the last time. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. When Laura arrived, she found him sitting, his face pale, his eyes teary. She sat beside him, held his hand, and waited. And he told her. Calmly. Without censorship. He just told her. And when he finished, she hugged him. She said it wasn't about the past, but about the present. That they were there, that their son was there, that life didn't wait for anyone to make a decision. That true love wasn't shaken by what had already happened, but was strengthened by the honesty of the present. Daniel hugged her back, with a strength he'd never felt before. And in that embrace, he felt that even the pain he hadn't asked for, even the burdens he hadn't deserved, were placed there so he could learn something greater. That everything he'd experienced had prepared him for this. To love again. And, more than that, to be loved completely. The next day, as he walked through the yard with his son in his arms and Laura smiling on the porch, he looked up at the clear sky and thought that the true ending wasn't reuniting with the one who left, but the peace of no longer wishing for that reunion. It was the freedom of being at peace with everything, including what could never change. And, thinking this, he knew the final door was closing from within. And that he was finally free. That spring morning, as the sun filtered through the leaves of the tree at the back of the yard, Daniel finished planting the last seedlings of the garden he had planned. Each plant was chosen with care, a new symbol of his rebuilding. The ground that had once seemed unstable now held firm roots. Laura watched from afar, holding her son, smiling softly at the sight of him so present in every detail of the new life they were building. It was as if, finally, they both knew that nothing could be taken from them. After everything they had been through, they were at a rare point of balance, and they knew it. But life, with its silent and unpredictable movements, still prepared one last curve in the road, and this time it wasn't pain or loss, but truth, the kind that doesn't ask permission to enter, simply arriving and occupying the space that has always been rightfully theirs. At the end of that same week, Daniel received an email with the subject line, "Document Review," from the office where he had last been contacted. He opened it slowly, certain it would be some bureaucratic formality regarding the fund left by Isabella. However, the attachment contained a previously unknown detail. Among the files on the flash drive he received was a video recorded by her, which had not been accessed before. The file was heavy and labeled only with the date, the same day Isabella had left her last letter at the registry office. Instinctively, Daniel got up, waited for the baby to fall asleep, asked Laura to go outside for a walk, and prepared to see what might be the last piece of a puzzle he already considered complete. The video started out blurry and shaky, but gradually revealed Isabella's face, visibly haggard, without makeup, with puffy eyes. The setting was a small, dimly lit room, probably in a simple hotel. She adjusted the camera and began speaking. Bluntly, she said she was recording this as a way to free them both. She said she no longer believed love could be rekindled, but that she needed to share something she'd kept bottled up inside for years. She took several deep breaths before continuing. Then, with a choked voice, she revealed that the boss she'd embarked on that trip with, the man she'd said she was in love with and dreamed of professional advancement with, abandoned her 2 months later. She said that during the trip, he'd made it clear he didn't intend to leave his wife, that their romance was just a temporary whim. And when she returned, already divorced, with her career in jeopardy, and without support, he didn't even answer her calls. But that part, she confessed, wasn't what destroyed her most. She said that after the breakup, she reached out to her few remaining friends, but none would listen to her. Her image was tarnished, not only by the adultery, but by the way it all happened. She said she was fired months later, without cause, and that she had to move because she couldn't find a job anywhere. Crying, she said she carried a self-imposed label, the woman who betrayed the only man who truly loved her. Then she stared into the camera and whispered, "The greatest betrayal I committed wasn't against you, it was against myself." Daniel paused the video. He was breathing heavily. He felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and a strange compassion. Not because he wanted to protect her, not because he still harbored any desire, but because he deeply understood how bad choices can consume someone from the inside out. He pressed play again. At the end of the recording, Isabella said she was leaving the country to start over, far from everything that reminded her of her downfall. And she left a phrase that echoed in his mind for a long time: sometimes, losing everything is the only way to understand the value of having had something. In the following days, Daniel spoke little about the video. He kept it as a final farewell, not to Isabella, but to a part of him that still wanted to understand why everything had happened the way it did. And over time, he realized that the most important answers didn't come from words, but from life as it is now. He and Laura enrolled in a course for first-time parents, made new friends, started planning family trips, and talked, for the first time, about having a second child. And in this plan, there were no ghosts. Only hope. Months later, during a lecture Daniel was invited to give on emotional management in the corporate world, he met a young woman who, at the end of the event, discreetly approached him. He said he had met Isabella at an NGO on the coast and that she spoke highly of him. He said Isabella helped vulnerable teenagers and that, in one of the classes, she shared her story, without names, without excessive details, but with a sincerity that moved everyone there. And he said that, at the end, he used to close his speeches with a phrase: "Never allow yourself to lose the love of those who were willing to stay with you during your worst days." Daniel smiled. He thanked her. And in that moment, he understood that the cycle had ended for her too, each in their own way. On the way home, seeing Laura reading a story to her son barefoot on the living room rug, he sat on the floor, rested his head in her lap, and closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, there was no more noise inside him. Only silence. A good silence. The kind that comes when everything that needed to be said has been said, everything that needed to be felt has been felt, and what remains is peace. The story that began with broken promises and broken hearts ended there, with two conscious adults, a baby smiling in the crib, and love manifesting itself in the little things. Nothing grand. Nothing cinematic. Just reality lived truthfully. Isabella, for her part, was never seen in public again. Her online traces disappeared. She no longer updated her social media accounts, sent letters, or left any contact information. But somewhere in the world, she likely continues her journey in silence, perhaps helping others avoid making the same mistakes. Perhaps starting over, as so many do, in the anonymity of rebuilding. But what remains of her story is a clear lesson: some decisions cannot be undone. And even when there is regret, there is no guarantee of redemption. Because time, however generous, does not rewrite what has been experienced. It only teaches us to live differently. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? What part struck you the most? What decision do you think was the turning point in this plot? Comment below, your opinion is very important. And of course, if this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other stories as impactful as this one. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys respect, trust, admiration, and the value we build with each other over time. Often, there's no going back, and what's lost is much more than a marriage. It's the right to be remembered fondly, it's the space we once held in someone's heart. The pain of a thoughtless choice can echo for years. This channel does not support any type of cheating. Here, we tell stories that show the consequences of wrong choices, so you never have to learn the hard way. Until next time.